welcome everybody. We're glad that you could be here with us, albeit virtually. The title of our talk is Listening to Children in Noisy Times, Voice and Polyvocality in Early Childhood. My name is Haney Yoon, and I'm an associate professor at Teachers College. And I study the intersection of play and literacy and pop culture, which is going to be the focus of what I'm going to share today.
Hi, my name is Cassie Brownell, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Like Haney, I engage in research with young learners, often sit around topics of critical literacy.
And I'm Amy Parks. I'm an associate professor at Michigan State University. And I work with children from pre-K to grade 3, usually around their experiences with mathematics.
I'm Tran Templeton. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas, or University of North Texas in Denton. My research is in children's photography and the ways that their photographs tell us something about how they want to talk about themselves and present themselves.
So how we're going to organize this session is we each thought it would be interesting to bring a piece of data to talk about the really expansive notions of listening and listening in multimodal form. So not just as something that we use our auditory senses to listen to, but hearing children out in really different multimodal ways. So across the session, you'll be hearing us kind of talk through some of those things, engaging informally with each other's data, and hopefully at the end, just drawing out new insights even in our own work.
So to help us think together today, for those that will be joining us during the live session, we have developed a sort of journaling tool where we hope that you can jot some notes and write down your questions and bring those with us to the Q&A session, which will follow this recording being played. And so we're going to play a timer now just for a minute where you can type in the link that you see here and download the form. There will be some jazzy music that will play, and we will use this music throughout the session to help you to have some time to think and engage with us. Hit it, Tran. Oh.
It felt like the longest minute of my entire life.
It's really good music.
Just a point on listening. Cassie had mentioned that song had a kind of jazzy undertone, but as I listened to it myself, I kind of read it as more of a pop song, so I think it kind of speaks to the ways that we listen, is situated within maybe where we, how we understand music. Cassie lived in New Orleans, so maybe jazz for her has a more expansive kind of feel to it.
Not sure I would literally say it's jazz. I think you're taking my word. Stretching them.
I didn't actually read it, so.
I meant more the jazz hands version of jazzy.
Yes, thank you.
So another thing that we would like for you all to consider doing, you can pause this video, is to download this article by Vivian Gussin Paley that was written first in 1986, but was reissued by Harvard Educational Review in 2007 because of its message. And the article really emphasizes this notion of listening to what children say. It's as simple as that, but she really draws out the stance that we have to take as teachers, as curious listeners, in order to really hear out the multiple meanings of children's inquiries and what they are trying to tell us. I think, Haney, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, and I think just going along with that, I think the idea that children have something to tell us presumes that we see them as actual cultural critics that have something to say about the world, and it connects with bell hooks. And I really love this introduction. I always talk about it all the time, but it's from Outlaw Culture. And she talks about like sitting with girls in the neighborhood and these young children, and she describes them as her girlfriends just chatting about cultural life, whether it's about paintings, whether it's about their play, whether it's about their culture. And I really love that she talks about them engaging in quote cultural criticism, because I think that connotes or already automatically assumes that children have some cultural capital that they can offer us and knowledge to give to us. So I think it resonates with Vivian Paley's work too, about like how if we listen to what children say, it's not just about hearing them or hearing the things that they're saying to us, but it's also taking seriously what they want to communicate.
I think what's also really great about this article is that Vivian Gussin Paley like talks about her own entry into the work of listening to children and how this wasn't something that she necessarily did automatically, but learned to do through watching others also engage with children. And I think that that speaks to like the reflective nature of teaching and like how we sometimes just have to step back and like listen and watch others, and addition, like also engage with kids to see what else we can learn from them.
Mm-hmm. And in it, she talks about the tape recorder playing a huge role in how she heard herself not listening first.
And it seems really important, particularly in this time when so many of us are listening to children for the first time through technology in maybe ways we haven't before. We both have the opportunity to go back and maybe listen to how we were listening, but also I know I need to develop new strategies for listening in this world.
For sure.
Yeah. I think it's that combination of self-reflection and self-critique.
Yeah. It's great.
Yeah, and having the humility to say, I'm sorry I didn't hear you the first time when you tried to tell me this. Because how many times as teachers have we been in the position where, you know, a child tried to tell us something, we said, it's not of concern right now, or I remember early on in my career, this teacher that I had learned from used to tell the kids that they didn't need to worry about other kids, you know, and the kids would come to her and start telling her things, and she read it as tattling because she didn't want to listen. She said, that's not your concern, that's not your worry. They were listening to each other, but she refused in a way to listen to them. And it always struck me, you know, it still stays with me, you know, 20 years later, just sort of for me, a guilt in not saying to her, can we stop and just listen to what they want to say about their concerns about someone else?
Yeah, I think right now too, we're offered a really different kind of position as teachers, as caretakers, and like as friends of children, to get to listen to them differently and talk to them in different sorts of ways. So I think some of those added stressors that we might have had of like, I need to be on this page on this day, or I need to hit this mark in order to like ensure that like our tests go well. Some of those have maybe been removed for us so that we can really engage in listening in a different sort of way and tending to children's bodies differently on screens as opposed to in classroom spaces. And I think that for many of us too, right, we get to these little glimpses on social media of the moments that go viral when the teacher is removed or locked out of a Zoom room at this point, as well as like the different ways that kids are adapting to being socially distanced in schools or communicating while wearing masks. and the different ways that they're telling stories to one another and sharing those stories with us. Should we get started?
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, great. So I think I'm up first. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about a different kind of listening, and I think we've all alluded to this as far as digital spaces or technology, that we start to listen to children in different ways. And so we thought we'd start this off by thinking or by engaging with something that's counterintuitive to what we think of as listening, as not something that you just use your ears to hear, but that there's ways that you can listen across children's cultural and social lives in classrooms. So this is Parker, and Parker is a second grader from New York City. He was often marginalized or relegated to the sides of the classroom because of a whole bunch of different labels that kind of marked him. So he's Black, he's behaviorally challenged, that's a category used by the school, emotionally disturbed. He was often sitting on the sidelines. And what I think he did was he kind of brought himself back into the social life of the classroom because he's a very gifted artist. These are some of his creations. He was really funny. He told jokes all the time. I mean, he talked nonstop, so you can't even like really ignore him. And so I think that despite attempts sometimes, not just in the classroom, but in society, to kind of shut people like that up, I think he managed to bring himself kind of into the focus and bring himself to the center. So I think that a lot of different things happened in his writing, in his drawing, that brought him recognition from his peers, that he got validation from his teachers. He had a lot of multimodal dexterity. And a lot of his literacy and language were tied to how he would to his identity, right? And that identity wasn't always a detriment in the classroom, but it was actually a resource. So that's him. And what I'm going to show you is one of his artifacts. So the next slide is an artifact of Deadpool. And this comes from a sign making, like they were making signs throughout the school year that was more like activist movements, like where they would make signs to march around the school and stuff like that. And so this is a drawing that Parker made of Deadpool. And before I talk about it, we're going to give you a minute to just look at it and see what you notice. You might be, whether it's about the drawing, whether it's about the letter, whether it's about the context, whatever. So we're going to have the longest minute of our lives again. Oh, and my 3 colleagues should be looking at it too. Okay, that was actually shorter than I thought. So what we wanted to do throughout this is just model for all of you just the kind of conversations that we can have with each other. And not just that, but also because sometimes when you are in conversation with others, you start to notice a lot of things that you didn't see either. So I'm going to invite my colleagues here to talk about some things that you're seeing here. What are you noticing about his drawing?
I am also a fan of Deadpool, thanks to a small kiddo I have gotten to hang out with. And so I think that this is an excellent drawing of Deadpool. But more than that, I really love how Parker incorporated like the Deadpool sort of logo into, or like the face of Deadpool into writing pool in the way that I think it is in some of like the different places that you might find the word Deadpool written. So like the second O has the little face of Deadpool.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I want to say back to that is like it for me, it highlights sort of what Tran said earlier with the jazz, like how much of listening is dependent on what you bring to it and like your ability to connect. So I actually have no idea what Deadpool is. So like I looked at that O and I was like, is that a pig? Like what is happening in there? Whereas like I focused on like in the quote, I think it says well, see, well, I'm going to say, so I read this as get Peter Parker because like that's like a superhero I recognize, right? And maybe that's not at all what it says. But it made me think that like my ignorance becomes maybe an entry point to conversation, right? Where I can say to a child, like, I don't know anything about Deadpool. Like, can you tell me what's going on here? And it's not about, oh, you didn't represent it or your like letters weren't correct enough for me to read it, but that I have this gap in my knowledge that maybe you can help fill for me.
I also don't know what Deadpool is at all, and I know that's something that I should know, but maybe it's because I work with between kids who are between 3 and 5 years old, but also I'm not the most versed in pop culture. So I think that was, for me, looking at this really highlights for me my ignorance and a desire to know more because I can't actually make out the words. I think it says gym outside is what we're doing, but it could not be doing. I'm trying to make sense of it, but it could be trying to make sense of it from my own adult perspective. Maybe it is we're booing or something else. So and I can't, it looks like Italian to me after that. So I'm wondering if there's, multiple languages used in Deadpool. Is it linguistically diverse?
So let me ask Cassie, what do you know about Deadpool?
Deadpool breaks the fourth wall a lot of days, and he talks directly to his audience either in the frame of the comics or in the various movies that have been filmed with Ryan Reynolds. Right? That's who stars as Deadpool. And so breaking the fourth wall is stopping and talking to the audience while the other characters don't necessarily do that.
Yeah, and I think to Amy's point, I think the idea that I wanted to communicate is listening, and how listening requires a lot more than just hearing children out at that particular moment, but it's also trying to investigate and learn about the things that you don't know a lot about. And so I think, the first, I think it says gym outside is what we're booing. Okay. And I think booing is very intentional. And I think booing versus fighting seems very in line with Deadpool, because Deadpool is basically this wisecrack funny guy who is like almost an anti-superhero, right? Because he like swears all the time, and he, makes a lot of sexual innuendos, and like all his jokes are about that. And he just like likes to just tell jokes all the time.
Really edgy.
Yes.
Edgy.
Very edgy. Yeah. And so I think like him actually having the gesture of his hand like this, and his hand on the side, and then his leg out, is like very emblematic of how he would stand, right? Because he either stands like that or he's like this, and he's like all joking, right? So it's very different from how like Superman or Batman or something would stand out. And I think the reason why I chose this for Parker was because I feel like this is like Parker personified. Like he likes to tell jokes. He's like, people want to shut him up all the time because you're like, does this ever, ever, ever stop? I think there's like this one quote from the movies where they're just like, where's the off switch? Right. And they're talking about him, right? Because he just doesn't stop. He's like really annoying and he's really irritating, but he also like cracks all these different jokes. And I think there's something about that, about him being like countercultural and hilarious, that I just think is so interesting that he decided to pick this person to make this particular drawing, right? And I think it says so much more about him. And I realized that the first time I saw it, I was like, awesome drawing, nice Deadpool. It's awesome. You got the swords in the back, right? And then I go back and do more research on Deadpool, and there just seems so much more to this than when I initially started. Yeah. And going back to you, Cassie, like I actually didn't notice the mask until like the 10th time I looked at this. I'm like, oh my God, there's a pool in there. And I think the other part of it is like the block letters is definitely his signature. And I don't know if all of us realize that making block letters when you're 7 is actually hard.
Yeah. I mean, I think about the process too of drawing, because the P looks like it started with, so just the planning that it takes to do something like this. How many times have we tried to kind of space out our letters and have not enough space at the end, when we're doing something by hand, and how much spatial awareness there is in this image.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And going along with that, I think a lot of children that made these, like this is a poster board, right? So it's a little bit bigger. What they did is they tried to translate what they were doing on like an 8x11 paper and put it on this poster board. And it obviously spatially didn't work out as well. And I think what he was able to do was like manage the whole space, which is also really hard. Yeah. It's hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
I was just gonna add one more thing in terms of like going back and talking about like the mask or like the humor and the stance of Deadpool. I think that like for me too, this is just a really good reminder of like the ways that kids live off page. Like they don't live just on the pages of what we capture in school, and if it's like in terms of how we measure them or the kinds of things that we get to see. Like what we see at school, though it's a third of their day often in non-COVID times, is still just like a tiny glimpse of like who they are as a person. And thinking about the kinds of spaces that were also created by you and by the teacher and by his peers to like affirm that this was a worthwhile venture to invest in learning and practicing bubble letters and practicing like knowing some of the other things you've shared, like other pop culture figures and superheroes. And that this was really a currency for him in the space of the classroom.
Yeah, those are great points. I think I know Tran's going to probably talk about this a little bit more, but I think the artifacts across time, like the fragments of how, when I look at this, it may not be as significant, and it may even seem like I'm overreading it a little bit if I just look at it as one thing. But I think it's like this collection of artifacts created over time, and how when I put them all together, it is almost like you have a magic moment where you're like, oh my God, and I wish I saw that a lot earlier, and you don't even notice that. And it seems so obvious at the time. But I think when I look at this artifact in isolation, it doesn't bring the same nuance or complexity to it.
And I think that goes back to the overall point of around listening that we've been making with this artifact, which is like bringing all this background knowledge, right? So some of it is this cultural knowledge, but the other knowledge is the alternate knowledge of this kid and this context and what's come before that you're also bringing to any moment.
Yeah. And I think, we're all school researchers, right? And we do research in classrooms, but I think all of us can say that all our research has made us school adjacent researchers too, where it's not just things that are happening in the classroom, but it's led us down like rabbit holes of other spaces.
Deadpool is a rabbit hole.
Yeah, definitely. I've read a lot of weird articles about Deadpool.
Well, now Tran and I are going to have to too.
So when you read those articles, you're able to sort of make connections between the character of, so the character's name is Deadpool? Okay. And maybe what draws Parker to that character and the sort of ways that maybe is reflective of what he desires for himself. Or
yeah. And I think even at the most basic level, right? Like he has speech bubbles a ton of times across his artifacts and literary pieces. And I think that's intentional because that's what he's interested in. He's interested in comics. He's interested in superheroes related to comics. That's what he reads, right? And so that's what he's going to do, right? So I think even that, but then to your point, Tran, like there's so many things that I wouldn't know without the context, right? Without understanding that. And it makes me think of how many times I am interested in the literary products that children create, but how I think that I know what I need to know and just move on. And what it can afford to me if I went back and looked at it again.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull out this Paley quote on page 158, where she speaks to what you're talking about. She says, the fact that the thoughts of the adult or the teacher and student are furthest apart in preschool, but we can expand this to elementary, makes it a fruitful place for research and practice in the art of listening to what children say and trying to figure out what they mean. My curiosity keeps me there, for I still cannot predict what children will say and do. One must listen to them over long periods of time, like a slow motion Polaroid developing its images piece by piece. Over many months, the children's patterns of thought and speech need much time to be revealed.
That's a beautiful quote. I feel like we should end there.
We've got 3 more artifacts to go.
Yeah, and I think the next slide is similar to that. I wish I had actually retrieved that quote that you had said. But I think the idea is that these themes from fairy tales, television, cartoons, mixed easily with social commentary and private fantasies, so that what to me often sounded random and erratic formed a familiar and comfortable world for the children. And I think we can all attest to these random private moments that seem of little value to us that have a lot of import for young children.
Thank you.
Thanks, Parker.
So I'm going to move on to my artifact. And this slide is to provide context, but also to remind me to give a shout out to 2 of my undergraduate research assistants at the University of North Texas, Maggie Harvey and Jay Unsa, who really helped me think through these things. And I think just working with them reminds me that listening is a joint effort too, and I think those of us who are happy as teachers in our classrooms have been happy because we've had a community of listeners, and it hasn't been us in sort of solitary, not solitary confinement, but as alone in the work that we do. So it's been a real honor to be able to have 2 undergraduates in particular, because they see things in a different way, right? They're not as inured to the process of schooling and research as I am. So they provide new insights for me. So the artifact that I'm going to show you is one of a series. I can't show the whole series, but I will show you 3 images. And the first one is the image that I can show you for a minute, and I'll explain that in a minute. What I'd like to do, this photo is taken by 3-year-old Oliver as part of classroom research with a group of children, 16 children who were in the classroom, ages 3 to 5, who were taking photographs as part of my research. And my research is broad in that I give them one prompt, which is take pictures. And the reason for that is I want to see what emerges from that. So I'm going to show you the picture that Oliver brought back, one of the pictures that Oliver brought back to me. He's actually on the bottom picture here on the screen. This is us going through the photos, and the photo is actually there, and he hasn't quite gotten to it, but when he does, he becomes very excited. So I'm going to show you the photo and have you look at it for a minute. And I want you to, there is much to see, but at the same time, there's not a lot to see. So I want you, in this case, to tell stories to yourselves, to yourselves about this photo. You know that it's taken by a 3-year-old child, 3 years, 11 months, so almost 4. What does it conjure up for you? hadn't looked at that image with the music. Realize when we think about multimodality, what music does to an image like this and how it might actually, partially tell the stories for us. And I'm obviously not expecting for you to know the story. So what stories did you tell yourself about this image?
I think that's so true about the music and the image though, because I think you're right. Like it didn't, I think if I saw it on its own or with a different music, I would think it's disgusting. But because it was so lively, and there was obviously a toilet there, that I was like, oh, I think I looked at it differently. So that's such an interesting point. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, viewers can pause this, go back and look at it without music. That's, the benefit of recording.
People might already be muting the music at this point.
I think I wanted to say that when I first looked at it, like I want to say I reacted like fully as an adult, which is maybe not surprising, and also as a mother, not as a researcher or a teacher. And my first thought was, this toilet is so clean, and then that made me think about like what it means to give 3 and 4-year-olds cameras to like take pictures at home, and how I as a parent might feel these images of my house going back to be discussed, which like again like made me think about this role of listening, like both to the visual image of here's this thing that is important to a 3 or 4-year-old, and I also have lots of stories about why a toilet might be important to a 3 or 4-year-old, but also like I don't know what we're bringing in terms of what we might be listening to, not just about them, but about their families and their world.
Do you want to share one of the stories that you would, because you alluded to stories about?
I mean, so my assumption is that like toilet training at some level is happening. Maybe at 3 or 4, it's pretty far along, but that tends to make the toilet like pretty central in one's life. So like that was one story. The other story is like, I think children get very interested in the way things disappear in the toilet. Sometimes they get afraid, like this, I guess Mr. Rogers talked about the bathtub, but like same thing, like, what could go down that hole. So I guess those were the 2 main like child stories that occurred to me.
Yeah.
I just made a connection right now to Amy, because I think you reminded me of all the different fears and anxieties that children have with the toilet. And I hope my niece never listens to this, or she'll probably be very mad. But I usually FaceTime with her, and I think one of the times I was trying to FaceTime with her, my brother was like, "Oh, Auntie Haney wants to FaceTime with you," and she's on the toilet, and she's very upset. Like she didn't want to talk to me. That was like a private space. And she definitely didn't want a camera up in her face, and she was not happy. So it just kind of reminded me of the different kinds of things that happen in that space. Like I think what you're saying, Amy, reminds me of, Lauren Berlant talking about intimate publics, right? And how different kinds of things that are so intimate then suddenly become public, and then that public also circulates. So.
And not to keep like hammering on this time, but my husband and I were just talking about how, because our kids are doing online schooling, like our home is public in a way that it was not 6 months ago, 8 months ago, however long it is now.
Yeah, right.
I think also a little bit like, so Amy, you mentioned like things disappearing and like how that works. I think also like just about bodies, right? Like potty training, and like thinking about like all the potty talk of like, how does this feel? And like the feelings maybe of embarrassment of like, if you don't make it to the toilet in time, and like maybe some shame that comes with that, because often when you do make it in time, there's a big celebration, at least for a little while. But then also just like bodies working in terms of like giggles that follow farts, and like just like, if they're stinky or if they just like make a funny noise, and then like the replication of those sorts of things. So I was thinking about bodies in that way, because I think that it's like an exploration of bodies and like how that functions, I guess. And then I also have never like looked at a picture of a toilet for this long, but I was very impressed by like there's like really nice depth going into this in terms of like the layering of it. So that's my adult reflection, having seen this photo before but not looked at it for a full minute with music.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you all had sort of shifting adult/child perspectives, and that's, really important. I think we can't discount our adult perspective, but it's important to try to step into the shoes of a 3-year-old, because had this been a photo taken by a teenager or an older adult, how that would be seen. So let me just tell you a little bit about this photo in the interest of time. I won't give you the whole story. Maggie and I are actually writing about this right now. But this photo was taken by Oliver, who he kept the camera for the longest time of all children I've ever done this work with. I think it was over 2 weeks long. I actually didn't think the camera was going to come back. And when he brought it back, he made no mention that there would be this photo and subsequent photos. So I'll show you the subsequent photos. So there was this photo, which he referred to this as toilet paper towels. And then this photo, which I have actually censored for lots of reasons, but it did have his poop in it. And I use the word poop because that's the word he uses. He labeled it as a sort of poop. He actually made me label it first. He made me say it. He held it up. He was so excited to find it. It's as though he knew it was going to be in there. He showed it to me and he didn't say a word. He just smiled. Look, it's a photo. And I said, poop? And he said, yeah. And he was so happy that I, was engaging in this image with him. This image, there were other images it was part of a sequence of his sort of routine in the morning. Part of the process is also asking kids to choose photos that they want to show to other children as a way to see what photos have particular salience for them, but also what photos do they want to sort of represent themselves in group, with their classmates, right? It's kind of like their own personal Instagram. And he chose this photo despite my sort of being a little hesitant about it. And actually when I developed these photos and looked through them, I was at home with my partner and I said, oh my gosh, I have 1,000 photos from children and never have I had a photo of poop before. And Chris said, why are you so freaked out by it? You love diaper changes. I do. I actually really love the intimacy of a diaper change when I worked with toddlers and young children. And I couldn't quite articulate what it was. And I think that affective moment actually got in the way of being able to listen. And I wish I had you all to kind of audience this image too, because I think you handled it much better than I did initially. So what I did at that point when he said he wanted to show this photo, I had to ask the teacher because it is her classroom. I have been invited into this work. It is a photo that is really an outlier. And she texted back and said she would prefer not to because of the potty talk that would ensue, all the potty words that would ensue. Which then led me to have him show it to a peer who was very excited to see it as well. They spun it around, they played with it, they talked about it. She reminded him that he needed to poop in the potty, and that stood out to me. And so I needed to kind of go back and look at Oliver again. And the story is that Oliver was going through what the school calls potty training, which Maggie and I have reframed to be toilet learning. And so he was undergoing that, and he was a child, the only child in the classroom who had not yet learned to use the toilet. And it was a big deal. He had a potty watch. The teachers constantly reminded him. He frequently had accidents, and that became a scene, right? We can recognize those scenes in school when somebody has an accident and somebody calls another teacher over and somebody's yelling to get me some wipes, and Even if you're trying to keep it under control, it still becomes a scene.
Sure.
And so, yes, to Amy's point, this was a big part of his life. And it spoke to, in a way, his lack of competence around this area as compared to other children. And this photo, I read after looking at this a little bit more closely as an image of his competence. You know, he did it in the toilet. Mm-hmm. And it was something he wanted to show other children and the adults around him. So, you know, we can say a lot about the body, and Cassie and Haney alluded to this too, and shame, and the ways that we come to feel shame around these things that maybe kids don't quite develop yet because, you know, they're 3 or 4. Sorry, that's my kitten. So yes, so that's the story of Oliver. I don't want to rush through it, but I am aware of our time. So yeah, they're always reminding me that I don't know the full story, and I don't know them yet, forever. So thank you for your input. Actually, that provides me a lot to think about as I'm writing this piece. Yeah, so this quote from Paley is a great way to wrap up my artifact, in that reading between the lines is both easier and harder when the setting is preschool, because the child is always operating from unexpected premises. I didn't expect the photo, and I didn't expect the stories that would ensue from that.
Thanks, Fran.
Okay, this is my artifact. So what I'm going to show you is a transcript of a conversation that happened in a preschool classroom. This is the teacher, those are the kids. And it is taken from a routine called daily oral language. So this was from a scripted curriculum that was based on the idea that, like, some children do not come to school with language, and so therefore they must be taught this language by the adults in the school. And I've always loved this little bit of transcript, but especially for a session on listening, it feels just like really key, because it is about like a curriculum that is designed to teach oral language, which of course includes listening, and then an act of listening by the teacher and by the kids. Okay, so the only other thing to say, I think, is the way this worked was there was a big chart pad with the curriculum, and you would flip it over and there would be a picture. And in this case, it was a picture of a tree and a doghouse and a snake. Okay, so then you can go to the next one. Oh, and we're gonna act this out for you. So we'll see how that goes.
Okay. Snake bite you, he bite your arm.
Mm-hmm. That's why we tell you not to play with snakes.
Because they'll bite you up.
Are some snakes poisonous?
Yes. If you put him in a doghouse, he still might get out.
A snake can bite a dog and turn it into a snake.
They will bite you on the leg.
They could bite your tongue.
They could bite you anywhere.
On the ground.
In water too.
I don't like snakes.
I do like snakes. I've
seen those that are green and yellow.
I got that brown at my house.
Okay, shh. We need to do our oral language. Touch your nose. Okay, so before we say anything, I guess Cassie's going to put on our little thinking music, and I would encourage everyone to think about where you see listening happening and not happening. All right. Oh, we still counting. So I think I'll just turn it over to my colleagues. What did you notice in there? Or what do you wonder?
I thought it was, oh, go ahead, Amy.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I really think it's interesting because Cedric, I feel like, isn't necessarily heard by his peers fully. Because he talks maybe about like a magical sort of instance of a dog being bit by a snake and then being turned into a snake. And then later he sort of gets cut off by Angel, and like in declaring that like he likes snakes.
Well, I think because I played the part of Tyrone and I felt like I definitely got the shaft. I think it's interesting that he brought up the idea of snakes and biting, and how I think there were some moves where the teacher was trying to move in a different direction, but it just stayed with biting and eating each other up. And then I thought it was an interesting move that the teacher was like, they could bite you anywhere, you know? So it was, and I found that so much is that even a teacher doesn't do just one thing where they don't listen the whole entire time, right? We also get caught up in that. And so I think that's a, you know, interesting way that children kind of collectively swayed that conversation.
Yeah, and I maybe because this just followed up the toilet thing, but just talking about the body, and now I'm seeing here more instances of the body and how kids want to talk about our bodies in different ways, whether it is in relationship with animals. And so the bite, you know, the bite is such an intense kind of action, and it's happening on the body. Yeah, I'm interested. I mean, I think there's different ways that they're talking about biting as well, you know, biting you up, where you could get bitten. I think the teacher might be talking about being bitten in locations versus maybe on the body.
Mm-hmm. I mean, not to put the focus back on myself, aka Tyrone. I'm wondering if like, what does it mean when he says if you put him in a doghouse, he still might get out?
I mean, my assumption there is because it had that picture of the doghouse and the snake, I was thinking like we could maybe try and get rid of it like this.
Yeah.
I don't remember if I said initially that this happened in Georgia, where snakes are, they're out there, they're part of your life, like both poisonous snakes and actual, I mean, other kinds of snakes. So it's like it's not an abstract discussion, actually, like what you should be afraid of and not afraid of when you see a snake in your yard.
Well, even the discussion of colors, right, like alludes to like potentially having more knowledge about particular kinds of snakes as opposed to others. Then this is because what age are these kiddos again?
4.
Yeah, so they're 4 years old. That's like pretty good.
Yeah, and I think sorry. No, and I think what you were saying, Amy, about this taking place in Georgia and how snakes are kind of part of their contextual understanding and landscape. And I think about that when I lived in Arizona, because I think there were so many things about snakes and lizards and cactus and geckos and like stuff that I have no knowledge of because I grew up in Chicago. I don't know what that is. And I think the knowledge of it is so different. So when a New York City's kid says a snake is going to bite you, it might not have any traction to it. When a kid from Georgia says a snake might bite you, they might actually have relevant knowledge that leads them to say that.
Yeah, that detail makes a real difference in how I see the transcript and how I hear it, and potential fears and ways of kind of managing the fear of the unknown snake being somewhere in the doghouse or where else or somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other bit of context that's not apparent to other people is like, unless you've been part of these scripted curriculums, like the way this like felt like a sea change in the moment, right? Because these like the normal oral language practice, it was a lot of this touch your nose, and then the kids were supposed to say things all together. So, you know, the snake is under the doghouse, the tree is in the air, right? Just say it like that. And all of a sudden there was this explosion, right, of all of this like energy around snake. And I think Haney like said, like you can see the teacher at some points trying to resist it and come back and then just sort of giving into it and like recognizing like this is what the kids want to talk about, so I'm going to let this be for a minute, and then feeling like, oh no, too much, we need to course correct back.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really beautiful about the transcript is that I think it shows the complexity of the teacher's work. Because I think I've been very cognizant of sometimes one-dimensional depictions that we give teachers, especially in the active listening. Because as I think Tran, you talked about this at the beginning, like I don't think teachers intentionally try not to listen to children. I think it's, you know, when even Mrs. Mason saying, okay, and looking at the clock, and then going, shh, we have to do oral language. I mean, I don't know any teacher who can't relate to that, right? Who can't relate to that happening. And I think that is a point where she stopped it. But there's so many points where she doesn't stop it either. And so I think that you don't have to be a listener and a non-listener, right? You can be both those things.
I'm going to play the Amy role right now too and say, let's take it to this moment too, when so many people are learning on Zoom and like how much more we're maybe surveilling what kids say and like when they get to talk. And like, I'm going to talk again about all those viral videos of like the teacher gets kicked out of the room and the kids take over and they're talking about toast or they're talking about like any number of things, but it's more of this conversation about like snakes and these sorts of social like sense making in some ways that we maybe are missing out on if we are making sure that kids are far apart from each other and we're making sure that kids are, you know, staying muted unless I like hold up my sign for them to unmute. And like I definitely don't envy teachers at this moment who are probably trying to make space for some of these kinds of conversations to happen, but like also have their hands tied in some ways, in terms of like what's possible in this moment. And so like it might take extra courage to create these moments and like extra effort in some ways.
You're reminding me of a really wonderful kindergarten teacher I follow on Twitter, and she was saying that she was having a hard time doing whatever lesson she was supposed to be doing because the kids wanted to just tell her things. And so she added a half an hour to her day that was optional, where kids could just like log into Zoom and she would be sitting there and they could just tell her whatever it is they had to tell her. And I just thought, like, that's really lovely. Like, what a lovely move to like sort of try and navigate the space to provide a time to listen to kids for what they're excited about, but then also say, and yet we have to, you know, learn the at sound or whatever.
So one of our former student teachers at Teachers College, when I went to watch her teach, she had incorporated office hours into quiet time. So she would be sitting at the couch. So, you know, usually quiet time for some teachers might be a time to organize and it's time to leave her alone so that she can organize. But she decided it was her time also to rest and to listen to children. So they had 30 minutes when they could knock on her invisible door and ask to see her in office hours.
That's awesome.
All right, should we go to the quote? All right, this is from Vivian Paley. I did not fare too well. Something was missing from my performance, a simple ingredient called curiosity. I was not truly interested in the people sitting around the table or curious about what they might think or say. Mainly, I wanted to keep the discussion moving and to avoid awkward silences. And for me, like, this is so critical to my own teaching. And I think to that moment with snakes, like the moment where the teacher sort of gives into her curiosity to like hear what kids are saying about snakes, and we can like think about the possibilities that are there if we follow that curiosity, as opposed to trying to enact this performance or this genre of what a discussion is supposed to look like, of taking turns speaking. If we don't bring that curiosity, what people are actually saying, then it isn't ever going to be like a real oral language performance.
Okay, so I am going to actually, we're not going to play the music because we're just going to play the video, and there's a transcript on the next slide. So no more jazzy tunes or poppy tunes. But I'm going to introduce you all to Jem, who was a third grade learner in a Midwestern classroom in the spring following the 2016 presidential election, which we are recording this pre-election, but it will be played post-election. And so I think that this is part of a larger project where I was hanging out with kids and we were engaging with lots of different materials to make an argument around issues of immigration. Jem herself said she was a recent refugee to the US. And so a lot of the issues felt very personally relevant. And the video itself is something that I didn't necessarily know about until after the time of composing ending. But in some ways, kids had a sort of free reign and access to a number of different materials. So she's going to be using Legos. And she is constructing like a border wall with Mexico, essentially, which she'll tell you about. That was a primary topic that we had discussed in the class. But she has recorded this on a tablet, which was another tool that they had access to. And so the video itself is about 2 minutes and 20 seconds. The transcript is along the side of it. Fair warning, you might get a little kind of motion sickness at some points when the video kind of transfers. And so I would just encourage people to see what you notice both in the transcript and in the video itself, and in like her talking within the video.
Hi, Miss Cassie. Our started, so I'm showing you this picture. This is, I was just gonna say, this is Donald Trump. It's a Donald Trump. Yeah, it's Donald Trump driving a car, and there's a guy. There's a police arresting this guy for saying, Donald Trump, we should not build a wall. So, and Donald Trump called the police and made this guy go arrested for just saying we should not have a wall. So let's get start with this one now. This is Hillary Clinton say, I should be the winner because I don't want to make a wall. Like you guys don't want to make a wall, do you? You shouldn't make a wall. So there's already the wall building, a couple walls, and these people, you see that guy's trying to go out, and this guy's trying to help people, and this guy's just like, I'm sad. And here's Donald Trump's card, and here's the Hillary Clinton, and I'm going to show you back. I'm going to get back. And there's people being sad and this guy is like trying to go away, move or stuff like that. He wants to get out of the wall. And Hillary Clinton is here, wants to help like the poor people, like Donald Trump sent him to do. So that's all I want to say. So bye, Miss Cassie. Bye, Miss Cassie. Bye.
I love that.
So the only other thing that I'm going to mention is that this video was one of several in a series on the tablet. This was like the culminating video that was on the tablet. The other videos ranged between several seconds to 30 minutes. The longer 30-minute video was actually one that Jem had made of herself, like making the wall, and it was mostly positioned at capturing her and the Legos, like sitting up across from her in the way that like my computer is now. But the other videos ranged in terms of like what she was capturing and like the narration that she was having. But I'm just going to turn it over to my colleagues.
Wow. I mean, it says so much, right? I mean, particularly now, I think just the word police stands out, and the way that she has constructed the role of police in alliance with Donald Trump. says so much about how she understands these larger structures that are in place that we don't give kids credit for knowing.
I mean, is it just me, or does she say Donald Trump? Donald Trump with a certain kind of cadence that is very appropriate.
At first she whispers it, right? She's almost like, it's almost like a bad word. And then she just is just much more confident and assertive in her pronunciation.
Yeah, I think one thing I'm thinking about with this is that in some ways it's like the opposite of some of the other things we've looked at, like the Deadpool or the toilet, where so much is intelligible, right? It makes sense from an adult perspective. Right? So like I would use different words and I wouldn't build with Legos, but like essentially like I've had this conversation, right? And so then that makes me think in a way I don't think I ever have before about how when it feels like we are really hearing and understanding kids, if there might also be things that we are necessarily missing because there is still that gap between adult and child and understanding, but we just don't notice it because what's on the surface matches up more cleanly with us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Paley quote before that was abbreviated around reading between the lines is both easier and harder when the setting is preschool.
Yeah.
That she says it's easier because young children rehearse their lines over and over in social play and private monologues without self-consciousness. Older children have already learned to fear exposing their common ideas. And I think, you know, you're taking that point a little bit farther and nuancing it some more. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
No, I think that's a useful connection. That as children get older, they're necessarily going to close that space, right? That's what developmentalism does. They don't turn from child to adult on their 18th birthday. They move gradually closer and closer. And so as that gradual closening happens, there's going to be more periods of understanding, but probably also more periods where we don't realize there was a misunderstanding unless we slow down some.
Mm. I mean, that's making me think, Amy, about how maybe we actually don't listen as closely to children as they get older, because maybe we think we know what they're saying, and that I love how you said like the gap and the proximity gets closer and closer, and maybe that supposed proximity also makes us listen and less attentively. And I think you're right about this content, right? Like all of us have feelings about this, and it's so easy to put our feelings on what she's saying here. And, you know, she could be saying something very different than what we thought, right? And so I think that's an interesting idea.
yeah.
I think another, like, just in terms of context with this too, is that, so I found this like long after I had interviewed her, and her interview, the sorts of description that she did in a one-on-one interview talking about what she had built with the Lego wall was nearly identical. Like I can almost map on what she said to me to what she said in this recording that she made to me that I didn't know existed. So I think that's a really interesting idea to think about the rehearsal. I also kind of wanted to go back to Tran's comment too about the idea of police. And I think this is because I like just participated in this Rethinking Police in Early Childhood Education webinar. But I think that it's also interesting that like she understands that the idea of police as community helpers can also be very complicated because it's like helpful for whom and to what end. And so that's like an interesting piece that I haven't thought about in terms of that specific role. But I think so much of what we talk about in early social studies is the idea that, you know, the police are community helpers, just like doctors and veterinarians, and like we should call them when we need help. And in this case, like she's very deliberate in saying that like it's Donald Trump who called the police for these particular sorts of reasons. So I think that's really interesting, and I hadn't noticed. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as a teacher, if your position is that police are community helpers, I think listening to this would provide a different way of thinking about that, and hopefully a different way of doing that curriculum.
Amy, did you mute because there were sirens?
Yeah, police are out on these streets.
Oh,
So I had to mute myself.
What a coincidence.
I know, right?
I also I think this reminds me of, on TikTok and in many public social media spaces, people are posting sort of accidental or things that they find that their kids leave on their phones. If there's one of a little baby who says, who turns on the phone and says, "Hi, I love you,"
oh.
Because that's how they understand that to work. But um, I think the fact that this is something that you found later, is, and wouldn't have happened had Jem not had the tools to do this. So, I mean, it seems very obvious, but I think that tool, along with the materials that she has to make this with, along with the freedom and agency to be able to speak politically in the classroom, all of those kind of coalesce to create this moment.
Yeah, and thinking about so the listening and the kind of rhetoric that's maybe contained in the oral language that she presents and in the Lego representative wall that she builds, definitely mimics conversations that are happening in the wider world. But so too does the simple act of, I'm going to make a video and produce that in the way that adults often do on Facebook Live or Instagram Reels or whatever it might be, TikTok. And so what happens when we provide those sorts of opportunities? And I think, again, that this is the end, right? She made a meta text for me explaining her process of what was going where. And so in the first video, the Lego wall starts in the far corner, and then she realizes as she's building there's not enough space for the things that she wants, and so she moves the wall to a different spot. So I think also just thinking about the kinds of processes of revision that also exist. Too. I know we're really close to time. Does anyone want to say anything else?
It's okay, we can edit. This was in 2016?
17. It was after the election.
Oh, right.
So it was following the executive orders for the #Muslim ban, and then the sustained talk around the border wall.
Yeah, and I imagine listening to this in 2017 would be very different from us listening to this now, pre-election. You made a really good point that we're recording this pre-election, and it's going to be heard by other people post-election. And so what we all in the audience get from this transcript? I mean, to me it reminds me that he never built that wall. So it reminds me of his failure. But yeah.
Next slide. So in fact, the children were continually making natural connections, adding a structure of rules and traditions according to their own logic. And so I thought that this was a very appropriate quote, just in terms of the kinds of things that Jem talks about and how she shows this with the Legos, but also in terms of the connections that she's making to me as an adult. And that was a sanctionable thing to do in the space of the classroom, given the kinds of structure and tools that have been put in place by myself and the teacher.
So in the interest of time, something that we can do is save our final discussion for the live Zoom, right? It will give us time to be able to rewatch and rehear this presentation, and then come with our takeaways from each other's presentations or audiences. Does that sound like a good idea?
I think so.
Yeah.
So thank you all so much for joining us today. We are going to ask you, if you haven't yet, to go to that same Google Doc, and we are also sharing our big ideas and takeaways for you there that we'll discuss with you in the live session. So one more slide, Tran, just to say thank you. Thank you, everybody. And we can't wait to see you for the live Q&A.